Good afternoon, everyone. We're delighted to introduce Mark Post, the Chief Scientific Officer of Mosa Meat, who are true pioneers in the cultivated meat sector. So welcome, Mark, to this April and May 2023 edition of Protein Production Technology International. Thank you for joining us. Before we get into Mosa Meat and the topic of cultivated meat, I just wanted to take a step back to the moment where you realized that you wanted to build Mosa Meat in the first place. So, as I'm sure we all remember, the burger that you revealed in 2013, which was the culmination of many years' work to get to that particular stage. Could you possibly explain the genesis of Mosa Meat and why did you start working in this field and when, and what drove you and what inspired you?
Right. Yeah, so Mosa Meat started in 2016, so 3 years after the unveiling of the hamburger. And we realized to make that impact, that was a nice proof of concept, but of course it was not a product and we didn't have a production system. We just did this out of the university with money from Sergey Brin. And in order to make the impact that we were aiming for, we realized that we needed to start a company. So I dreaded that moment for a long time, having been an academic for 30 years and, late in my career, start a company. Now I've started 2 companies, and because I just thought it would make my life more complicated, and in fact it did, but also made it more fun, to be honest. So I don't regret that. We started working on this as a government subsidized scientific project in 2005, and that ended in 2009 with a statement from the government. Yeah, you have achieved all this, quite nice, you've met your milestones, but we don't see any societal interest in this particular topic. This was a subsidy from a grant from the Ministry of Economic Affairs in the Netherlands, so not the scientific section, but economic affairs. And they said, okay, we don't really see a lot of interest, so we're not going to continue funding. And of course, we were quite frustrated by that and said, okay, then we're going to make some noise. And fortunately, we got funding for that from Sergey Brin, and that's why we were able to present that hamburger in London in 2013. And to our delight, that kind of was the start of an entire industry.
Absolutely. And you just mentioned that the original sort of government funding, they said there wasn't enough appetite, so to speak. Would you say that this has changed now, particularly in the Netherlands?
Oh, absolutely. In this country, you cannot open a newspaper without reference to the environmental impact of livestock agriculture. So there's now a lot of tailwind to make this happen, both politically, financially, and also scientifically. So yes, we certainly, the time has changed and the mindset has changed, and we saw that already kind of in the public acceptance for the discussion, but we now see it at many different levels.
Very good. So cultivated, cultured, CELAG, lab grown, what's in a name and what have you settled on at Mosa Meat and why?
We have settled on cultivated meat, and we started with cultured meat, but then it became cultivated meat. To me, to a non-English person, this is kind of the same, but for 2 reasons. One is we would like to stick to the meat category because we feel we are making the same tissue, and in the end, it would be silly to not call it meat if it's the same tissue. So that's one. But you need to inform the public and the consumer that it's made in a different way, hence the qualifier cultivated or cultured. And yeah, so for me, that is, it's not a marketing name. It's not a, something that people will trigger to buy this. And it's not intended as such. It's intended as a description of a category.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think you're right. We need to have a consistent way of naming these products in order to make it more palatable to the consumer, not only, to have a clear descriptive term, but also something that is appetizing. I think, I don't know if you agree, but using terminology such as lab grown or synthetic meat is very off-putting, and it could potentially be very damaging if regulators were to go down that route and use such terminology. I don't know if you agree.
Yeah, I do agree. But, there is also a tendency, albeit kind of still nascent, a tendency to call this cell-based meat, which
Hmm.
as a scientist, I heavily object against. For the public, it may not make a lot of difference, and they may say, "Okay," and then I understand what it is. As a scientist, I have problems with this because I'm a cell-based person, so it doesn't really tell me anything. That's because regular meat is also cell-based. So I, it's kind of an illogical term to me.
That's very interesting because I was just on the call with the FAO this morning.
Right,
They just published their paper on cell-based food safety risks, and they're very much set on using cell-based, which I think is very interesting. Whereas
right,
over in the US, the FDA is using cell cultured. And also, I don't know if you saw, but the UK FSA also published a paper earlier this month, or last month, sorry, and they specified in that paper that they prefer the term cultured rather than cultivated. So I think there's still quite a lot of people doing their own thing and calling it many different things at the moment. But
right.
Mosa's set on cultivated, so that's
Yeah.
clear.
And within the FAO committee, I'm co-author on that manuscript of the FAO committee, and I heavily fought against using the name cell-based, but I lost.
Oh dear. I actually thought we'd evolved from cell-based as well, but there we go.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's cast our minds back to the momentous day back in August 2013, when you were on television unveiling the very famous first cultivated meat burger. What was the reaction to that unveiling, and was it well received?
I think it was well received. We didn't really do a statistics on it, but roughly 80 to 90% of all the public exposure was positive,
Mm-hmm.
in spite of headlines like Frankenstein food and yuck. But if you then read through the article, it was actually quite positive. And we didn't know. It could have gone either way, right? Because we always had some positive feedback from media, but they came to us and they were interested in the subject. So you never know how that kind of
Mm-hmm.
colors their perception and their writing about it. But now we went out and gave everybody the opportunity to publish about this. And it was mostly positive, but the vast majority was positive, which is interesting because obviously it's quite a controversial subject. So it could have gone either way. And I interpret that positivity as
Mm-hmm.
a sort of underlying sentiment with meat eaters that this is actually a problem, and that if there is a solution for it, we would welcome it. And most people don't even realize how big that problem is. And according to the FAO, in
Mm-hmm.
2050 it becomes a completely unsustainable problem. So that kind of illustrates, especially now, but even in 2013, that people
Mm-hmm.
would like to have a solution for this, and that to me explains kind of the positive attitude.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the media play a massive role in how these things are going to be perceived. How do you see the role of the media, and do you see there being a big risk of them setting the narrative on cultivated meat and going down the route of using very negative terminology like frankenfood? And also, can we draw parallels from what happened with GMOs back in the 90s? And is there a risk that this could happen again with cultivated meat?
I think there is that risk. This is a technology that concerns food, and people are emotional about food and not
Mm-hmm.
necessarily very rational or knowledgeable about food. It's also a technology that is hard to understand, like GMO. So yes, it could go quite easily the GMO route. Again, here, I think what sets it apart from the GMO discussion is that the GMO discussion initially was completely non-transparent. They had to kind of start their storytelling after the fact. And then you are in the defensive mode, and then it all becomes a lot more problematic. That's also the reason why we try to be completely transparent about this, to tell what it is, how we do it, and to avoid that problem. The second is that GMO started as a technology to cover up for a side effect of a pesticide, right? And that's not a good story to tell.
Very true.
So I can understand Monsanto that they had a hard time start being transparent about this because it's not a very good story to tell. Whereas here, with cultivated or cultured meat, you have a good story to tell. So there's a big difference between those two, and I think that's why we see also in acceptance studies, and granted these are surveys and not selection studies in a supermarket, but that we see a relatively high level of acceptance and understanding why we are doing this. Yet it doesn't need a lot. It needs only a couple of scandals to turn it the other way. So we still have to be quite diligent here and good at our communication.
Absolutely. And this leads me to a slightly controversial question. What's your opinion of the mammoth meatball? Is that too soon, or do you welcome it? What do you think about Vow's mammoth meatball?
I think it's a gimmick. It basically, it's kind of fun thinking about these things, but it's a gimmick, and it's also quite confusing in a way that, this was obviously not a mammoth piece of meat. There was one protein and only, a kind of fraction of a protein that was mammoth DNA derived. So it's drawing attention to the field. That may be a good thing, but it may also be, okay, this starts to sound a little bit more, even more techie. And so we have been quite down to earth. We have a problem. The problem is meat consumption and meat production in now and especially in the future. We need to have a solution. This is a technology that basically provides the same tissue and is a solution to that problem. And everything else that is possible that you can think about this technology. And in the past, we have seen even crazier examples than mammoth balls. If you have a designer group in the Netherlands, Next Nature, that came up, that had a couple of students from the Technology University of Eindhoven to come up with all sorts of new ideas and new designs on what you could do if you have this cultivated meat. But the essence is that we are trying to solve a problem, and that we do only by replacing meat by meat and not by mammoth meat.
Yes, indeed. And a regulatory nightmare, I can tell you, going down the mammoth route.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah, so it's been a very big and exciting 12 months for cultivated meat. Obviously, we saw Upside Food getting their no questions letter from the FDA, followed by Good Meat very recently. We saw cultivated meat on the menu at COP27. So, what are your views on the progress that has been made, not just over the last year, but the past 10 years? And what have been the biggest industry milestones that you think have received less attention over this period of time?
Yeah, sure. So I'm quite happy with how this develops. It takes longer than you hope for, but everything takes longer. And retrospectively, 10 years is not a long time for a completely new technology like this. What is quite nice to see is that companies are scaling up production, and scaling was considered an Achilles heel of this technology, right? Are you able to make this at an industrial scale? And companies like Good Meat and Believer Meat and Upside and also Mosa are gearing towards that and showing that you can scale this. So that's a big thing. The other thing, of course, is that there are first regulatory approvals, which we always kind of expected because we know there's nothing, there's no health risks at all in any of these products or production systems. But yeah, you need to pass the regulatory approval. So that's good news. What we are still looking at, I think, there's two things. Is currently what we see is mostly hybrid products and not pure products. So the majority of the product is still plant-based, and animal cells or animal tissues are added as sort of an ingredient. That is a good first step, but we still have a long way to go to get to pure tissues and to the real meat that we envision. And that's the second step at a price that's affordable for, let's say, people who enter a supermarket. And of course, we are still somewhat away from that.
Yes, absolutely. And where does Mosa Meat sit in the cultivated meat sector today? What is your current business model? Are you going for B2C, B2B, or are you targeting high-end food service, high-end restaurants? What are you thinking as your position point into the market?
Yeah, all of the above. No, initially this is going to be a somewhat expensive material with low availability. So you go to restaurants and you go to very limited outlets. That's just a necessity of it. And you can build any marketing story around it, but in the end, that's just what's given by the parameters. This has the possibility. So we as a company focus on beef for environmental reasons primarily, and there are two components to that. It's the muscle component, and it's the fat component. So we do both, and one. But these are separate production lines for the muscle and the fat, so that gives you the opportunity to also use them as separate products or as separate ingredients. And especially for the fat, that has kind of interesting kind of applications, because you could envision that you add the fat to other food substances and get the typical flavor of animal fats in your product without having to add all sorts of artificial fats that are either flavorless or don't have the same cooking behavior, and you have to add a lot of other stuff to make it tasty. So there are opportunities here because of those separate production lines to actually also market them or sell them as separate things, and then you have more like a B2B strategy. So it's pretty much all of the above.
Okay, great. And in terms of nutrition, you said having the cultivated fat or the fat is going to be providing a very similar taste to animal or beef derived products. But in terms of nutrition, how are you ensuring that the cultivated beef that you're producing is nutritionally equivalent to conventional meat? Is it going to be on par, or are you going to try and enhance the nutritional characteristics of your cultivated products?
Yeah, we don't really have an intention to enhance that. So we are really intending to make this on par, meaning that for the muscle tissue, all the proteins are there at sufficient quantity so that you have the full amino acid profile and the heme, iron, and everything that is associated with the nutritional quality of beef. For fat, we do the same, but for the fatty acids and for the taste. What we see, however, and this is somewhat serendipitous, is that the fat that we are creating in the lab or in the factory is in fatty acid composition very, very similar to conventional fat taken from a cow. However, the level of unsaturated fatty acids is somewhat higher. So there is the possibility, we haven't done any studies yet, but there is the possibility that this fat is actually somewhat healthier for you than regular beef fat.
Very good. That sounds very encouraging. And just thinking about the manufacturing process, as far as I understand, Mosa Meat has opted to use primary cells rather than stem cells. What are the benefits to this approach, and what are the risks to this approach?
Right. So that's correct. These are primary cells. By the way, we call them adult stem cells because the satellite cells in a muscle are the stem cells of our muscle. They have all the characteristics of stem cells, but they are not embryonic stem cells. So embryonic stem cells can make any tissue. Muscle stem cells can only make muscle tissue. And we also derive from that same biopsy, we derive precursors of fat cells. So they are the stem cells of fat, if you like. And so what we do is we let them expand and proliferate for many, many times. And then what they are very good at is making tissue. So of our muscle cells and our fat cells, 90 to 100% of the cells actually participate in muscle creation or fat creation. That's the advantage of using primary cells. The disadvantage is that because they are already somewhat committed to a particular tissue, they lose some of their proliferative capacity. So you cannot get, so if you take an embryonic stem cell, you can, let's say, make 10 million kilos of beef out of a single biopsy. If you take an adult stem cell, you can only make, well, at most 10,000 kilos of beef out of a single biopsy. So there is a limited proliferative capacity. So you have to go back to the animal once in a while to get a new biopsy. And that's kind of the disadvantage. The other advantage, by the way, of the primary cells is that you don't need to genetically modify them. And since we are based in Europe and there is, as you know, regulatory issues with genetic modification, but also consumer acceptance issues, we see it as kind of a unique selling proposition to have a non-GMO approach to this.
Absolutely. I think it's very, very, very wise in Europe to avoid using modified cells. We're just not ready. I don't think that the regulatory framework's just not there yet to cope with that. If we look at Impossible Foods soy leg hemoglobin, which is just authorized everywhere except for the EU because it's classified as a genetically modified food, and therefore it's been stuck since 2019, being evaluated by EFSA. So yeah, we don't want to see cultivated meat fall into that GM food trap.
Right. But I think this is especially true for Europe. But I also think in other geographies and in other consumer bases, if you come up with a GMO-free alternative, it would have kind of a unique character to it and an advantage. We are not religiously against GMO, but it's just for this particular purpose, the combination of cultivated meat and GMO could be a problematic combination.
Yeah, I think keep it as simple as possible to start with. Definitely. We're seeing, some EU member states openly, saying that they're not in support of cultivated meat. Obviously, we've seen the news from Italy very recently, they're making moves to preemptively ban it. We've also seen French as well saying that they're generally opposed to cultivated meat. Is Mosa Meat concerned about this? And what are you doing as a company to engage with governments and different stakeholders?
Yeah, we are concerned about this. It needs to be qualified a little bit. There are also quite opposing voices within Italy and France. So it's not as black and white as it's now kind of portrayed in the media. We are engaging with the political parties, with the governments, with the NGOs to see how we can, where these sentiments are coming from and how we can deal with them. So we're quite active in that field. We also have an association of a number of colleagues, and so we do this together with 12 other companies in Europe. But yeah, it's something that we're continuously looking at and trying to understand and trying to respond to it. At a government level, at a political level in Brussels, at local levels, and at basically public levels.
Yeah, and you mentioned earlier about the situation in the Netherlands, and we've seen obviously very recently the political party that's gained a lot of seats and a lot of prominence. What's going on there, and is that a concern? It sounds as though there are a lot of very angry farmers in the Netherlands, and what's your view on this, and what is the role farmers can play in cultivated meat?
Yeah. It's to be fair, these are regional elections, right? It's not a national election, and our biggest concern is that the nitrogen discussion in the Netherlands, which is heavily led, that will be frustrated, which is at the detriment of the little nature that we have in this country. So that's a big concern. What we also see in kind of a limited way with some farmers is that they are quite nuanced about this and say, okay, we also see that there are issues here, that we have a big impact on the environment, and we would like to change that. And if you give them the option to move away from livestock farming to crop farming, which some of them are already doing, for instance, in pork, because it's very difficult to make money with pork farming. My neighbor moved from pigs to potatoes. And if you give them the opportunity, instead of being bought out, which is now kind of the alternative, to move from dairy or beef, we have very little beef, but dairy and beef, to crop farming, crops that can be used as a feed for the cells, then that might be a better alternative for them than just being bought out. So we can kind of direct a narrative towards this goal. And we see that some farmers, definitely not all, but some farmers are quite receptive to this idea.
Good. Yeah, and just sort of building on that, in October 2021, you were awarded a React EU grant for Feed the Meat project, which was designed to lower the cost of cultivated beef. And in this, you were working with the animal feed company Nutreco. Could you tell us a little bit more about this relationship, how it evolved, what the goals are, and why the cell feed supply chain is important?
Yeah, sure. So we were approached by Nutreco as a big feed merchant and also by other feed merchants or feed producers, by the way, because they see us maybe potentially as a threat. Okay, if you succeed, then we lose our business. So quite interestingly, we had early interest from a number of feed producers in the Netherlands and in Europe. Nutreco kind of stood out. It's a Dutch company, so that makes it a little bit easier, I guess. And they stood out with very specific ideas on we can provide all the ingredients that you feed to cells, but now in a feed or food grade kind of level, and thereby reduce the cost by 100-fold of all the basic nutrients that you put in this feed. And so what we have with the EU fund, what we have done is very systematically test all sorts of replacements, food or feed grade replacements of what is currently still all pharma grade. And not surprisingly, all these substitutes work. They work the same as pharma grade. And it's completely to be expected. It was just never done. So Nutreco is now building a small factory supplying at scale all the ingredients that we have tested that we can easily replace for the pharma grade ingredients, or we can replace the pharma grade ingredients with these, thereby reducing the cost of the medium tremendously and also providing the scale of production.
No, and that's great. And obviously using pharma grade, the specifications are very different as well compared to food and feed grade specifications. And so that it's, from a regulatory perspective, it's much easier for regulators to get their heads around using food or feed grade components rather than pharma grade components.
Yeah, I'm not an expert in this, but this is a particular area of interest for Nutreco, of course, and they have a lot of experience with the regulatory paths of each of those components. And yeah, we don't envision that there will be major obstacles there. And where there are potential obstacles, we try to just avoid them. So far we go for the route that all the replacements that we know are acceptable from a regulatory perspective, that we implement them, and the others we deal with the regulators and say, okay, this is now a different specification, but we don't see any problem. How do you feel about that?
No, exactly. Yeah, no, that's very good. And just now moving a little bit further afield. So we recently published a story about your partnership with Esco Asta over in Singapore. Could you let us know a little bit about the significance of this partnership for you, and how important is Singapore today in the cultivated meat sector?
Yeah, so the relationship with Esco Aster is basically that with a CMO, so they are going to produce locally our product, which is from many perspectives is a good thing. One is we don't need to do all those investments ourselves and kind of duplicate our team and have kind of a Singapore entity. They have the experience also with good meat, and yeah, they have the experience with the scale of this cell production. So for us, that's a very positive thing. It's still slightly the tech transfer from us to Esco Oster is going to be a little bit more complex than the tech transfer of good meat to Esco Oster, because we add a substantial differentiation step to the medium, to the product.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what they need to learn and need to establish. But we're quite confident that they will be able to do that. So for us, that's a very good step. Singapore obviously is an important area, not from a consumer kind of perspective, but from a regulatory perspective and a intention from a government perspective. So they really, understandably, since they want to produce 30% of their food in 2030, they need to be very interested in all these technologies that require not a lot of land and not a lot of resources, so that they can locally produce meat and other products of fermentation or any other technology that doesn't require land, water, and so forth. So it's understandable from their perspective. It's very helpful for us because they have a very good understanding now of the regulatory path. They have learned about this. They have implemented this. They are fast because they are very, very interested. And they always claim that they are kind of a stepping stone towards the Asian market. We will
Mm-hmm.
see about that, but that would be kind of an added advantage, if you like.
Yeah, I mean, Singapore, I always describe it as my, the absolute favorite regulatory framework. They're just a dream to work with, and a pleasure, and always so helpful. And yeah, it's always a pleasure working with them. And it's great to see what can happen when the government is behind a particular initiative.
Yeah, absolutely.
And sort of going on, thinking a bit more about regulations, obviously we haven't seen a novel food dossier for cultured meat yet be submitted to the European Commission and EFSA. What's your pathway to market for Europe?
Yeah, quite clearly, we want to be the first to submit a dossier to EFSA. I think we are set up for that quite well because we are doing a lot of analytical studies ourselves, develop the analytical technology so that we can have ISO certified labs to do all the analysis. So our submissions are not based on calculations or estimations. They are based on hard data of analytics. Mm-hmm. And so I think we are set up to do that quite well. As you know, the conditions for submission in Europe are a lot stricter and more extensive than they are in other geographies. And we see that also as kind of getting a gold seal once you have that approval, right? So as an example to the rest of the world, okay, we have passed kind of the toughest regulatory
Yes.
environment. So be happy.
Yeah, no, absolutely. If you can get through the EU approval process for novel foods, then you know your product is safe, 100%.
Right. And we do actually get the feedback from other food companies that although it's considered tough,
mm-hmm.
it's also quite well organized and quite well kind of defined, so that in some cases it's actually not that slow. It's actually, because it's well defined, it can go faster. But yeah, we do have the political situation where all the member states have to look at this as well. Right.
Yes, 55% of the EU member states, representing 65% of the population, need to vote in favour to authorise the product at the end of the process. So that's going to be a challenge when you have Italy and France already sort of saying they're not on board with it. So it's going to be interesting, but I think we have a lot of time, to change, to educate, and to get member states on board.
Yeah, and populations on board. So I'm not too pessimistic about that. But if you actually understand what's happening in France. It's a relatively small yet vocal part of the population and the government that is opposed.
Yeah, no, exactly. And it's very hard. I mean, I'm 100% convinced that we can demonstrate that cultivated meat is safe. And in terms of novel foods, we tend to see that there aren't political reasons for voting against the approval of novel foods, which we see with genetically modified food. So I'm quite hopeful that we will see a very positive outcome.
Yeah, so am I. But yeah, again, we have contingency plans, but it's as a European company, we're quite focused on getting the first regulatory submission and approval in Europe.
So what are your timelines? So, once you get your dossier in, when are you expecting to get approval?
That's a hard thing to, because it's not up to us, right? It's the only thing we can do is do our submission as well as possible and according to the guidelines and the instructions as possible, and then hope that indeed it's a year and a half and not longer than that. We don't expect it to be shorter than a year and a half, so that's clear. In terms of when we are ready to submit, I cannot say too much about this, but this
Of
is
course.
the next priority of we have just submitted in Singapore, and this is the next priority.
Yeah, no, I think I think a year and a half to 3 years is usually the timescale that we're looking at in Europe. And yeah, the key to reducing those timelines is to produce a very good quality dossier, very high quality data, as you say, performed in accredited laboratories following internationally recognized methods and sticking to the guidance as much as possible.
Yep. Yeah.
But it's a tough nut to crack. So yeah, I'm very much looking forward to seeing the first novel food dossiers go in for cultivated meat.
Yeah. And again, this is we now see that we are ahead of the game in terms of the analyses. So yes, that sets us in sort of a good that provides a good condition for the submission in the EU. Yeah.
Brilliant. And in terms of scaling up, last October you announced the expansion of your pilot facilities, and it was planned to be open this year. Where are you with this, and what do you see? What will we see happening in these new facilities?
Yeah, it's open, and the official opening is the 8th of May. But it's already now open, of course, and it's still a small scale. It's a pilot facility, so it's a small scale production that allows for indeed regulatory submissions, maybe some small tastings. The tasting issue in the Netherlands is still somewhat complex. We are allowed to stage tasting, but it needs to be under conditions and under the control of the Ministry of Health. But we are allowed to stage tasting, so we will use that material to do that and to also get the sufficient material for the regulatory approval. It will not be a production for marketing yet because we cannot market in Europe. So if we would do that, we would be way too early.
And how are you building sustainability into your operations? Is this important to Mosa Meat?
It's very important. Actually, we are filing, and I think set up to become a B Corp. And we have worked with a number of other sustainability institutions to basically look at all our processes and where can we make it greener and with less CO2 emissions. So it's the reason why we are here, to be honest, the sustainability. So it would be kind of weird if we would not pay attention to that. But in the end, the most impact we can make is with the product and with the way the product is being made. So one big sustainability effort is in, how much feed do we actually use to create a kilo of meat? That's by far our biggest metric. And we have an entire team working on reducing that by specific feeding strategies where you reduce the amount of medium that you need per kilo of meat.
Feed conversion ratio in
Exactly.
traditional agriculture.
Exactly. And of course, we put solar panels on the roof and all those type of things, and we make the building as sustainable as possible. But by far the biggest impact is coming from making the product as efficiently as possible.
And what next? So after you have your beef product being sold globally, what comes next for Mosa Meat?
We are here to primarily make an impact. So we want to reduce the number of cows tremendously. And that means that you have to grow, either scale up or scale out. And we believe that scale out is a faster strategy, so that you license other people to other institutions in different parts of the world to manufacture according to your specifications and your standard operation procedures. So we have chosen that model of scaling out exactly because we want to make impact as fast as possible, because we feel the time crunch of climate change and having to face 2050 with whomever 8.8 or 10 billion people and a lot more people eating meat in spite of the increasing number of vegetarians and vegans in Western Europe.
Yes, and then this is quite a difficult question. Do you think cultivated meat will succeed?
It is a difficult question, but of course, for me, the question is easy, or the answer is easy. Yes, otherwise I would not be spending most of my time on this. But yeah, I think we are kind of at the right the right time frame where people realize that this is unsustainable, and so essentially we have only one choice, and that is either become vegetarian or eat cultivated meat. And I think the whole attention to that people may not like this idea is somewhat exaggerated. If we talk to people, or if we let people eat sort of labeled cultivated meat, they have no problem with it. We eat all sorts of things that we don't know how it's made or what it's made of. So you have to go past that initial hurdle and have early adopters, which we have more than enough. So I don't see that as a obstacle. And no, the real interesting part for me, at least, is scaling up, getting the price down to regular prices. Otherwise, it will be a niche product, and we're not interested in that. And eventually get a full portfolio of products, also, ribeye steaks and pork chops and what have you. And that's the next challenge that we will face.
I've just one or two last questions. I speak to a lot of investors, and it seems as though they're starting to get cold feet about investing in cultivated meat. Are you seeing the same kind of thing? We've obviously seen, sadly, new age meats having to close. Is this concerning to Mosa Meat in terms of the investment landscape?
It's hard for us to tell, because it's hard to distinguish this from the effects of the Ukrainian war and inflation and the fall of the Silicon Valley Bank and all those things. So in that climate where investment needs a trusting climate, and currently that trust is low. So it's hard to distinguish those. We find that the investors that we talk to are still quite interested in investing in technologies that have an impact on climate change and have sustainability impacts. But yes, they are also looking at, of course, and they should, at the technical economic analysis. And there's no question, this is a capital intensive technology initially. It's also a big market with a lot of opportunities. But yeah, you need certain breed of investors to take that chance, see the potential, and but also be able to take that chance, and are in this for the long haul and not for the kind of immediate return of investment. Absolutely.
And then finally, what would you like your legacy to be for the food sector?
That's quite clear. We want to make an environmental impact. So if we can reduce the number of cows to a level where they don't have a an appreciable contribution to greenhouse gas emission, I would be happy.
Fantastic. That's about all we have time for. Thank you so much, Mark, for being so candid with your responses and being so honest, and also sparing an hour from your very, very busy schedule. And yes, we really look forward to following the Mosa Meat success story in the years to come, and can't wait to see that novel food dossier go in as soon as possible. So thank you very much.